Good evening. I'm Lady Nopeingham. I hope you've enjoyed the countdown to Halloween videos so far. Tomorrow, on the big day itself, I have a special, relatively family-friendly treat planned. A true classic with a twist, written by a master of the genre. But this week, the fear has been building. The stories have gotten increasingly scary day by day, and now, being the eve of Halloween, tonight's stories are the crescendo, the truly frightening finale we've been building up to all week. Written by Darkheroxx from Reddit, these stories are well-crafted nightmares, so be warned. Some may find these stories disturbing, so listener discretion is advised. And now, grab a flashlight, hide under your covers, and let's get into the stories. Old Wounds Opening. This is something that happened to me 10 years ago. Now, take this as you will, but what you're about to hear is something I can barely explain myself. Nonetheless, it's something I wish to be told, so bear with me. Just some backstory. My name is Ray, and I was, and still am, a freelance photographer. I was in my 30s, and I was living in New York around that time when I got a call from a Mr. Peters, who said that he was the executor of my father's will. I wanted to hang up right then and there, but this man was just doing his job despite the fact that it was for my father. My father was the darkest part of my life. In fact, my biggest regret was that I waited until I was 18 to finally escape him. Growing up, I only saw him as someone full of anger and liquor who couldn't keep his fists to himself. My mother had left us when I was around 6 years old, and of course, that made everything much worse. I would go to school, trying my best to hide the cuts and bruises from the night before, and I'd go home for it to happen again. He was as meticulous as he was terrifying. No one would ever know what he did to me, and I was too afraid to do anything about it. As I got older, I became more resilient as he got weaker. Years of cigarettes and alcohol had caught up with him, so he switched to more emotional abuse, saying that it was my fault that my mom had left. I tried my best not to let his words faze me, but it did. It hurt to hear something like that from my own father, and the doubt and depression he had planted into me. I'd rather have him hit me. Despite his abuse, I tried my hardest in my studies, and when I was finally old enough, I went off to college. I took care of everything myself, and I never looked back. My father had passed away, and as previously stated, Mr. Peters was distributing his assets. He didn't have much, but he had left me a cabin that had been in our family for decades. I was quite taken aback. I hadn't talked to him in over 12 years. I absolutely refused to go to his funeral, but hearing that he actually put me in his will, I was surprised he thought of me despite everything that had happened. I thought about it for a moment, but eventually agreed to take it. Worst case scenario, I could sell it, and that would be the last part of him I could get rid of. The cabin was deep in the forests of Pennsylvania. I had packed enough for a week and went about it as a mission. I would go to the cabin to check the state that it was in and decide what to do with it, maybe get a few nature shots while I was at it. If I decided to sell it, great. If by some chance I wanted to keep it, I guess it wouldn't be that bad. It was a few hours' drive from where I was at, and on the way over my arms and legs began to ache as I thought about my father. He hadn't been on my mind for so long, but as I drove in silence on that long stretch of empty road, memories of him began to flood in. I wish I could say I was happy when I heard the news of his passing. I wish I could say that I felt absolutely nothing at all. But when I heard that he had finally passed, well, I'd be lying if I said my heart didn't ache a bit. He wasn't always horrible. There were blue moon moments when he was sober and kind, but that doesn't excuse what he had done. I shook the thoughts of him from my mind and continued the next couple hours of the drive. When I finally reached the forest, I followed a worn and winding path towards my father's cabin. The skies were filled with dark gray clouds, making the scenery around me look foreboding. My father used to take me and my mother up here every now and then when he had time off work. He insisted that the fresh air would help my mom, and being out in nature would help me man up. It was early in the afternoon when I finally pulled up to the cabin. It was almost exactly as I remembered it, though a bit more weathered and aged. As I got out of my car and walked towards the front porch, an antique rocking chair creaked back and forth, while the chill of the autumn air made me shiver. I had to push a shoulder into the door as I opened it. The old wood door swung open with more force than intended, and I stumbled inside. I was absolutely awestruck as I stood at the entryway. Looking around the interior of the old cabin, I noticed that it was completely unchanged, as if the last time I was here, time had paused until I returned. The sofa, the decorations, the television, everything was where I remembered it. I walked to the dining table next to the kitchen and brushed my hand over its smooth surface. Not a speck of dust. Did my father come up here recently? He was never the type of person who would clean up after himself. His home was filled with empty bottles and cigarette butts. I didn't think anything of it. I was thankful I didn't have much to clean up. I slumped into the old floral sofa. My body sank into the cushions. I thought about what I was doing there. I'm not sure why, but I felt a want, no, a need to come back to this place. This cabin held a lot of memories. It contained history that long surpassed me. My father was so proud to tell us that his great-great-grandfather had built this place with his own 2 hands. Every head of the house would come and fix it up and whatnot throughout the years. I scoffed as I thought about his damn smirk, the same that's placed on my own face. I closed my eyes. The drive must have taken more out of me than I thought. I tilted my head back and began to drift into short rest. I tried to relax as I took a deep breath of cold, fresh air. I exhaled, or rather, I tried to exhale. I couldn't let the air out no matter how hard I tried. I felt my throat begin to constrict as if someone was pressing their hands onto them. I tried to move and thrash to try to get up, but my body wouldn't budge. My heart raced as I suffocated, and as suddenly as it came, I shot up from the couch and gasped in oxygen. I placed a hand onto my throat and felt nothing out of the ordinary. Did I just have a nightmare mixed with some kind of sleep paralysis? I glanced at my watch. A few hours had passed since I got here. I sat back onto the couch and wiped some sweat from my brow. That nightmare really shook me to my core. I looked down and saw my hands were trembling. I gripped them tightly to stop the shaking. I rushed towards the bathroom in the hallway and turned on the hot water at the sink. I watched the steam rise from the water and splashed a handful onto my face. I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw that my eyes were pink, and I looked at my neck to see deep purple bruises. 5 small oval bruises were on my neck, 1 on my right side and 4 on my left. I lifted my neck to further inspect them, and sure enough, it looked like fingertips were gripped onto my throat. I turned the faucet off and rushed out of the bathroom. I leaned onto the nearest wall to steady myself as a wave of anxiety fell upon me. Memories of my father flashed into my mind, images of him hitting me and choking me as a child. I took deep breaths while holding my throat, completely afraid of something other than me grasping it. A few minutes had passed until I was fully able to catch my breath. I looked at the bathroom mirror again, and the bruises were still there. Where did they come from? I was sure I was the only one here. Of course I was the only one here. I was going to be here for a few days. I couldn't allow myself to be spooked over something. I felt sick to my stomach, so I didn't want to eat anything. I walked around through the hallway towards the bedrooms. The cabin was small with only 2 beds and 1 bathroom, but it was cozy enough. Past the bathroom was a door to the right. I opened it to reveal a small boy's room. There were no decorations, just a twin bed, a dresser, and a desk. A loud thud emanated from the other bedroom, my parents' bedroom. I quickly stepped to it and opened the door to reveal a room with 2 separate beds and a large dresser. It was as bare as mine. I looked around to find what made the noise, but couldn't find a trace of anything. The room felt so cold, goosebumps began to cover my arms. My breath visible as I exhaled, and I saw that a window was wide open. I crept towards the window and placed my hands on it to close it, when I noticed something deep within the woods. The figure was peeking from behind a tree. Its neck was completely bent over to an L shape, and it had long, wild hair that hung down. I kept my eyes focused on it and held a scream. It wasn't moving. It just hung its neck in that bent position as its hair swayed in the wind. Were they lost and needed help? Surely they could see me looking out at them. I gathered some courage and called out to them. "Hello? Are you lost or something?" I yelled. They didn't respond, but before I could ask them anything else, they slowly sank behind the tree. I'd be lying if I said that didn't unsettle me, but I just locked the windows and double-checked all the doors. I just pushed it into a corner of my mind, thinking it was someone being a creep. I was getting tired. The time had flown by, and night fell upon me and the cabin. I slipped into my old childhood bedroom. The sofa and my parents' bedroom were out of the question. I lied on the lumpy twin bed and looked out the window. There was no light whatsoever, and it was quiet. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to drift to sleep, but I felt so uncomfortable. That's when I heard something making a clicking sound. I looked towards the direction of my window, and I heard it slowly opening. The sound of wood scraping pierced the silence of the night, and I jolted up. "Who's there?" I called out into the darkness, and I heard a low, cracked inhale from beyond the window. Whatever was outside exhaled, and as it did, I could hear something breaking like someone cracking a bundle of twigs. I didn't know what else to do. The only options I had were to run or to fight. So I jumped off the bed and ran towards the front door. I had left the keys on the dining room table, so I could do everything in one swift motion. I had ran right out of the room and made a direct shot towards the keys, but they were gone. I got onto my heels for a sudden stop and looked frantically for my keys. I heard something thudding from behind me, and I saw the figure again. I turned to see the figure peering at me, with its bent head from behind the entryway of my bedroom, its hair slumped down. It was close enough that despite being consumed by shadow, I could make out its thin, womanly figure. Its hand slowly came around from the doorway, and it clutched onto the wooden walls of the cabin. Its arms were long and had multiple joints in them that popped as it reached towards me. Its hands had long fingertips that ended with broken pieces of fingernails. I fell backwards onto my ass as the figure's hand swiped at me. I shuffled backwards while keeping my eyes fixed on it. My body began to ache, and I looked at my arms as welts, cuts, and bruises began to form all around them. The welts swelled to burst, blood beginning to pour from them. I gave out a scream as the injuries began to spread from my arms to my torso and to my legs. I felt some bones within me bend and break as I lie crippled on the floor. Flashes of my father's face appeared in my vision, and I began to convulse. Blood flooded the inside of my mouth, and I began to choke. I tried my best to spit out the blood, but more and more began to drown me from the inside out. The figure was on the floor now. It used its long arms and fingernails to scratch the wooden floor and creep its way towards me. That was when I finally noticed her face. I could finally see her hair part from her bent neck as it dragged onto the floor. Her face was swollen, bruised, and bloodied. I could see imprints of a hand on her neck, and I could finally see the face of my mother that I hadn't seen in so long. She had one eye that was visible. It was completely bloodshot, but it wasn't staring at me. I slowly tilted my head upwards to see a large and shadowy figure that loomed over me. It had its grip on my neck, and it felt angry and malicious. I pushed through the pain on my body, the pain within me as well, as I thrashed about. I looked towards my mother, and she reached a broken hand towards me. I picked myself up, but slumped onto my knees. The shadowy figure was still over me. I didn't know what else to do but yell, "Leave us alone, you fucking monster!" And I heard it fucking laugh. It sounded so inhuman, but at the same time it was familiar. It was my father's laugh. So I knelt there and shouted at it. I let it know how much of a monster it was. I told him how fucked up he was for doing what he did, all while spit and blood splattered from my mouth. I was never really over him, and I could never erase him. But he stood still in front of me, while I stood between him and my mother. I shouted and cried until morning finally came, and when the sunlight crept through the windows, I realized that they were both gone. I finally let everything go, and I crashed into the floor again. I fell unconscious into a deep sleep, and when I awoke, there was still a bit of light creeping through. I picked up the pieces of myself that were left. I was beaten and bloodied, but I had another urge. Something was calling me. I decided to grab my camera and step outside to take some pictures of the scenery. Whenever I take pictures, it always puts me in the present. I'm able to forget about everything and focus on the here and now. I stepped outside and got my digital camera ready. The sound of the leaves crunching underneath me filled me with nostalgia. As a kid, I would rush into the woods and pretend I was an explorer. That's when I remembered something from when I was a kid. I looked around the trees to find a specific one. It was close to the cabin, and I'm sure it was still there. It took a minute to remember where it was from my memory, but I eventually found a tree with Ray sloppily carved into it. I lifted my camera to focus a shot and snapped a photo. I looked at the small screen and almost dropped my camera. Thankfully, it was around my neck. The photo showed the small, thin tree with the carving, and on the sides were gray-blue fingertips gripped onto the wood. I shot my attention to the tree. I even walked around it, but nothing. I went to the base of the tree, and with my bare and bloodied hands, I began to dig. It took hours, and night came again, but I was in a trance. I didn't want to stop digging. I was sure I'd broken some fingers, but I finally felt something smooth, deep within the dirt. I took my phone and flashed the light upon a skull. I uncovered the rest and sobbed deeply. I sobbed because I was right, and my mother didn't leave me. I called the police, and they came with an ambulance. They were shocked to see the state I was in, but I just wanted some medical attention. I didn't return to that cabin for a month, and when I did, I came back with a priest who said he would bless the old place. The cabin had a lot of history, and a dark history. But afterwards, it felt a bit lighter. Now to the present day, it's been years later, and I have a son of my own. One day, I'll take him up to the family cabin and fill it with happiness, giving that dark history a bright future. I saw hell in the hospital hallway. Sorry in advance for the long story. I'll be calling myself Sarah, and I work at a hospital in upstate New York as a nurse. I was originally from Pennsylvania, but just recently moved to the Big Apple for a change of pace and scenery. I love doing my job because I genuinely love helping people, but some things started happening here recently that has made me rethink my plans of staying here. There are tons of stories at the hospital I work at. There's one story of a man who was admitted one evening because he collapsed at his construction job. When a doctor came to examine him, he told the man that he would have to stay a while to run some tests. Well, time passed, and he had gotten much worse. He could barely breathe, and he was in immense pain. When the results finally came back, they told the man that he had asbestosis, a condition that scars the lungs from breathing in asbestos fibers from his work. Unfortunately, that was not uncommon back then. Well, the man didn't take the news very well. He was in pain, and he didn't want to allow the disease to eat away at him any longer. It was later that night when he walked towards his door and looked to see if the hallways were empty. There was an eerie silence around him, and no other signs of life in his vicinity. The man proceeded to get on his knees and place his neck on the doorframe. Using all of his strength, the man proceeded to slam the wooden door onto his neck over and over and over. It wasn't instant, and the man was in a crazed stupor as he continuously slammed the door onto his neck. Blood splattered everywhere as the sound of flesh tearing and bones breaking filled the hallways. His labored breaths began to gurgle as his throat began to fill with crimson. A short time later, some nurses had found his mess of a body, and their screams carried into the night. Apparently that floor isn't used anymore, and you can still hear the door slam. I've been there and done that. I get it. It's fun to scare the newbies when they arrive, especially the ones on night shift. I'm sure this place has some history, but I doubted the existence of the supernatural wandering the hospital. At first, when they told me about the ghosts, I chuckled and brushed it off. But when my CNO, Chief Nursing Officer, insisted for me to be careful my first night, I thought I'd pretend to take it a bit more seriously. I ended up going weeks without experiencing a single thing, aside from the normal crazy of just working in a hospital, especially during COVID. With the massive influx of patients following the pandemic, we had to clean up and open every room that we had, even the previously mentioned unused floor. It was one night I was going through the halls and I had to investigate a noise. It was a weekend during the absolute craziness of the pandemic, and we were all being spread thin. We all had to go to areas where we usually wouldn't go, but it was okay. We were all focused on getting these patients situated. I was taking care of an area that didn't have any COVID patients. This was the floor we recently opened up. We had a patient, who I'll call Jack, an older gentleman who was brought in because he had some chest pains. I came into Jack's room one night, and he asked me if I could give him anything to help him sleep. When he first came in a few days ago, he was extremely bright and chipper despite his condition, but tonight he was pale and shaking. That concerned me, and I asked him if his chest pains were keeping him up at night, and he just looked at me with small tears forming in the corners of his eyes. He shuddered as he told me that someone keeps coming into his room at night. This was my first time hearing about anything like this, so I asked if he could tell me more. Jack downcast his eyes as he began to rub his shaking hands together. He told me that late at night he would hear his door open and slam shut. He would wake up and see a dark figure crawling towards him. Now, I asked if it was another nurse that we had, but Jack was sure it wasn't them. Jack described the figure as a large man with short white hair. His mouth was open, and he said that blood was slowly trickling out of it. He began to shiver a bit as he continued to describe what he saw. Jack continued by telling me that the man was in an old hospital gown, but it was worn, with splatters of blood on it. He began to close his eyes as he told me the man's neck was crooked and broken. The flesh on the neck was torn open to reveal shattered bone. I felt sorry for the man. I assumed that he had more issues than just chest pains, so I assured him that I would get something that would help him. I had to make my rounds to check on other patients, but I told him I would check on him again soon. As I closed the door to his room, I could hear him quickly shuffle back onto his bed. I made my way around the hall towards the other patients. They all complained about losing sleep, not from a man visiting them at night, but the sound of a door slamming in the hallway. I talked to some other nurses about it, and their faces were in absolute shock. They didn't want to listen to any more, and told me I shouldn't be trying to scare them. I didn't know what else to do, but maybe it was just a coincidence. After forcing down a can of Red Bull and a cup of coffee, I looked at my watch. It was around 3 a.m., so I wanted to go and check on the patients. I walked towards the elevator and pressed the button to go up towards the old floor. I forced a laugh as I remembered Jack's account of the man he saw, one of the old stories about the man who killed himself, and a few other tales the other nurses had told me. I didn't want to scare myself, but the description of the figure and the fear I saw in Jack's eyes, that very fear began to slowly sink into me. The elevator doors slowly creaked open, and I was met with a dimly lit hallway. We had to save on power, so late at night we wouldn't have all the lights on. As I walked towards the hall, the lights began to flicker. The fluorescent lamps began to buzz as my footsteps slowly echoed through the hallway. I saw something at the end of the hall from one of the rooms. Jack's room. Something was peering at me from the bottom of the doorway. Only the top of their head was visible, but I was able to make out a thin tuft of white hair atop a man's head. As the lights flickered, the flashes of light hit their face, and I could see their eyes glow white. I could hear my breath begin to shudder as I stared towards the head, and I could hear another breath. It sounded as if someone was taking short breaths while submerged in water. The quick inhales were low, and I could hear something snap with each labored breath. I jumped as a sudden slam erupted from their direction, and suddenly another, and another, and another. The sound of a door slamming began to echo throughout the hallway, and each time it slammed, I could hear something squish, something snap, something tear. I wanted to let out a scream, but nothing would come out. Was I having some kind of waking nightmare? Hallucination? Has my mind conjured some sort of phantom from all of those damn stories? Before I was able to let out my own, A yell could be heard down the hall from Jack's room. His cry of terror made my blood run cold as ice. Then another scream, and another scream, all coming from the other patients' rooms. The sound came rushing towards me, a dark symphony of horrified cries resonating into my skull. My legs shook, and I fell onto my knees, trying desperately to mute the sound by covering my ears. My head was ringing, and I felt blood running from my nostrils. Tears began to flood my eyes, and when I screamed, I couldn't hear anything at all. I was completely drowned in screams. I looked forward, and I saw the head slowly move out of the doorway. When it fully emerged from Jack's room, I could see that it was indeed in an old hospital gown, and it was on the floor, propping itself up on its legs and arms. Each limb was bending in an inhuman way, like the legs of a spider, the way the joints shot up and bent downwards. The figure's head was bent, broken, and it swayed back and forth as its eyes flashed white from the flickering of the lights. Each time its neck swayed, it splattered dark red blood onto the walls. It was looking towards me, with its mouth slack-jawed. Despite being surrounded by screams, I could faintly hear its blood-soaked inhales. It just stared at me, and I began to slowly shuffle backwards towards the elevator doors. That's when it began to step towards me, and each time it got closer, the dimming lights behind it would pop and shatter. It crept towards me, slowly, while the darkness followed behind it. I was sure I was in hell at this point as the screams got louder, the figure creeping closer, and the darkness covering the hallway. It was only a few feet away from me now. Its limbs groaned and cracked as it moved closer and closer. I'll never forget how its white eyes stayed fixed on me as its broken neck swayed back and forth, with its jaw hanging down to reveal a small flow of blood. My back was completely on the elevator door, and it was so close to me. It began to scramble over me. Its bent, spider-like arms were on either side of me, and it pushed its face closer to mine. All I could see were its rotten, pale face, and behind it, a dark abyss. I couldn't hear anything anymore. The screams must have deafened me. But I pushed my head into the elevator door and closed my eyes tightly. As it got even closer, I could feel a cold breath brush my cheeks. I suddenly fell backwards and my head fell onto the floor of the elevator. I looked up to see another nurse, May, looking down at me, confused. She saw that I was white as a sheet and quickly got down to examine me. Blood was trickling out of my nose and ears, and tears were gushing out of my eyes. I could barely speak. All that came out were cries. I looked towards the hallway, and it was dimly lit, with all of the doors closed. May rushed me out of there, and I had a doctor go out of his way to look at me. I had to take a week off of work. I was a complete mess, and when I finally recovered, I vowed to not speak of it ever again. Out of sight, out of mind, I never saw that figure again. There's whispers, of course, from the staff, saying that I saw a ghost. I'm just too afraid to admit to what I saw. What scares me the most is that it was just one story. There are many, many more that are echoing through this hospital, and I'm terrified to see the worst of them. Do You Love Dolly? I will be changing the names of the people involved with this story to avoid any further scrutiny. My family has already been through enough. I'm posting here to seek advice, help, anyone who would listen to my story to at least make me feel that I'm not going crazy. My wife and I live in an average single-family home, both bringing in an average salary, living our average lives while raising our beautiful little girl, Alice. We had lived so peacefully, up until a few months ago, on the day of my daughter's 5th birthday party. That day, Alice was so excited to be turning 5 that she woke us up at 5 a.m. She jumped into our bed and screamed, "Happy birthday," at the top of her lungs. I groggily looked at her. Her long curly brown hair, her cute button nose, and her beautiful brown eyes. She was the spitting image of her mother, Rose, who was pretending to snore beside me. Rose cracked an eye open and whispered, "Please, 5 more minutes." I rolled my eyes at her but cracked a smile as I lifted Alice up and carried her to the kitchen. "So, birthday girl, what do you want for breakfast?" I asked. She scrunched her face like she was thinking extremely hard. Pancakes," she exclaimed. "Blueberries?" She gave me the biggest smile and eagerly nodded her head yes. "So you're excited for today?" "Yeah," she said gleefully. "Oh, Grandma and Grandpa are coming too, so make sure you give them lots of love." Breakfast was easy, but my head throbbed as I thought of all the things we had to do that day. Kids' birthday parties are always like that. Something so simple, like just having people over and opening presents, turns into the most stressful day of a parent's life. Alice insisted that her 5th birthday party should be at 5, so until that evening we had to prepare the food, drinks, and decorations. When Rose eventually woke up, we had breakfast and began our day. I spent the majority of the day picking up the balloons, grabbing the birthday cake, getting last-minute decorations, and calling in delivery for pizza. When all was said and done, we finished right before the party started. The last thing I had to do was tie some balloons to the mailbox to make sure people knew which house. Once 5 p.m. crept around, family and friends made their way over. So far, so good. The only thing we needed was the pizza, which came by a little after the party started. As I opened the door to get the food, I noticed a box at my doorstep. It was a pretty decent-sized box, a little bit bigger than a shoebox, wrapped in black paper with a pink bow on top. I grabbed it along with the pizza and put it with the pile of other presents. A few hours later, and the party was going pretty smoothly. No one got hurt, so that was a plus. After passing out the cake, Alice was eager to open her presents. The living room was completely covered with different colored wrapping paper. My mother walked up to Alice and handed her that black and pink box. "Don't forget this," she said with a smile. Alice gave her grandmother a tight hug and gratefully took the box from her. Her eyes gleamed with excitement as she thoroughly looked at every corner of the present. She carefully removed the pink bow and slowly unwrapped the black paper, putting on a show for the elderly woman. Inside was a small brown box. Alice shrieked with excitement as she revealed a doll. It was a small doll in a green flannel dress with long, curly red hair. Its eyes were glassy with a piercing pale blue, and its skin was so pale. It was eerily lifelike. She hugged it with all of her might and thanked my mother over and over. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she screamed gleefully. "What are you going to call her?" my mother asked. Alice pressed the doll's face to her ear and closed her eyes tight. "She says her name is Dolly." The rest of the night went by in a blur. Kids ran around, we cleaned up. Alice didn't let go of that doll. It was around 9 p.m. when all of the guests had left. Rose took Alice and her new friend to her bedroom to settle down for the night. I was washing up some dishes when my mother offered to help. "Hey, don't worry about it, Mom. I got this," I insisted. "Go relax. I know you and Dad have a long drive home." "It's nothing. Your father has had plenty of coffee, and we only live an hour away," my mother assured me. "Right. Oh, and thanks for getting Alice the doll. It hasn't left her side all night," I laughed. My mother looked at me with a puzzled look on her face. "I didn't get her that doll." Sure, Mom," I winked at her. "You know she's been asking for a new doll for a while." She set some dishes onto the drying rack. "I'm serious. I have no idea who got her that doll. I thought you did." Rose tiptoed into the kitchen. "What's going on?" I glanced over to Rose and asked, "Hey, did your parents get Alice that doll? I know they couldn't make it tonight, but did they ship anything?" Rose took a moment to think about it. No. Their gift came in yesterday, the canvas." I thought long and hard about who could have gotten her the doll. Then I remembered. Actually, it was left out in front of the door. I grabbed it a little while after the party started. "Well, it'll come to us eventually. She absolutely loves that thing. She made me tuck it in and everything," Rose laughed. My dad popped in, signaling their cue to go, so we walked them to their car and saw them off. We stretched and yawned. It was a long day, so we were so ready to get into bed. I glanced over at the window that went into Alice's room and saw the blinds close shut. She must have wanted to see her grandparents leave before going to sleep. "I'll see you in bed," Rose whispered in my ear before she walked into the hallway. I went to lock the front door when I heard a loud scream come from our bedroom. I rushed in to see Rose sitting on the floor at the end of the bed, laughing. I asked her what was going on, and she pointed at the bed. I looked over and saw Dolly lying on our bed. Rose laughed as she explained that when she lifted the blankets, the doll was lying underneath. She looked towards Alice's room and brushed it off as a prank. "That brat," Rose chuckled. My wife is such a scaredy cat, so it's not uncommon for me and Alice to try to prank her. We laughed at Alice's little surprise as I picked up the doll and walked to return it to her room. Alice's room was just down the hall. On my way, I felt a bit uneasy as I heard whispering coming from the living room. It was faint, but it was definitely whispering. Alice whispering. I crept around the corner and I saw her sitting in the middle of the living room in the dark. "I love Dolly so much. Thank you," she whispered excitedly. "Yeah, that was a pretty good trick," Alice whispered while sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor. She tilted her head. "Oh, I don't think they would mind at all." Alice stretched her hands forward as if she was grasping something. "I'm so glad you're here." Alice, who are you speaking to, sweetie?" I turned the corner and asked. She turned to me and smiled. "No one." Alice lifted herself up and ran towards the hand that held Dolly, grabbing her into a tight hug. She looked up at me and asked, "Daddy, do you love Dolly?" I laughed. "Well, of course, sweetie. If you love her, I love her too." "Good. Dolly and her friend said they love you too, Daddy," she said. Dolly and her friend? I was going to ask her who her friend was, but she ran off into her bedroom. Who was she talking to? She never had an imaginary friend before. I thought she was getting too old for that. But I didn't think anything of it. She's 5, so I doubt she understands proper pronouns and sentence structures. I brushed off her whispering as some kid stuff. The following morning, I woke up earlier than normal. I had had difficulty sleeping that night. Even though I was fully dressed in pajamas and had a blanket over me, it felt like I was freezing last night. I asked my wife about it, but she said she slept soundly. I thought I was coming down with something, so I checked my temperature just in case, but everything was normal. It was a Sunday, so my wife and I were free. We had asked Alice what she wanted to do that day, but she simply told us she was busy playing with her new friends. When Rose asked who she was talking about, She simply answered, "Dolly and her friends," then rushed to the backyard with the doll tightly in her grip. Friends? I thought to myself. Was she conjuring more imaginary friends? I brought it up with Rose, but she shuddered at the thought. "Don't tell me that. The doll is creepy enough as it is. I don't need imaginary friends to add fuel to the fire." "Don't be such a baby," I teased. "You didn't have an imaginary friend growing up?" My loving wife ignored me and continued to scroll through her phone. I looked out the window to the backyard and saw Alice standing with her hands covering her eyes and yelling out, "One!" I looked around the backyard. I assumed she was playing hide-and-seek. 2. I wondered how many friends were hiding. 3. Maybe I should sneak back there and hide too. 4. I saw Dolly sitting against a tree we had. 5. Dolly wasn't by herself. 6. There was something behind the tree where the doll was. It was tall and naked. 7. Alice began to giggle. It peeked out from behind the tree, a long, slender shape with gray, bruised skin. 8. She laughed. "I can hear you." Where its eyes were supposed to be, there were 2 dark voids that poured a black ooze. 9. It looked towards Alice and smiled a disgusting, toothless smile. Blood began to pour out its gums, and it began to walk towards her. It didn't move right. It moved like something imitating a person walking. It was exaggerated and clumsy. 10. "Alice!" I shouted as I rushed into the backyard. She jumped in shock and removed her hands from her eyes. She began to tear up as if she was in trouble, and I scooped her into my arms. I looked towards the tree where that thing was, and just saw that doll sitting there. Rose rushed out and asked what was going on, but I didn't know either. Alice sobbed in my arms, and her mother quickly grabbed her away from me and brought her into the house. "Daddy didn't mean to scare you," I heard her say as she walked away. I looked over at the tree, and there was really nothing there. I picked up Dolly, and I stared at her. I brushed some grass that got onto her face, and I felt sick. The skin felt so real. The next few days went, and we kept having these small incidents. It started off with small things being misplaced. Sure, I'd lose my keys, but one day they ended up in the coffee pot. I yelled at Alice, but she said it wasn't her. Rose began to feel really uncomfortable around the house too. She insisted that we all leave the house together. When I asked her what was wrong, she told me that the other day she had heard something whispering from Alice's closet. I can't help it, but I was always skeptical about paranormal things. I even brushed off the hide-and-seek thing as seeing things from lack of sleep. But when my wife told me she started hearing things, I didn't think she was crazy, so I looked around her closet. Rose and Alice went out one afternoon to grab some dinner, and I was inside Alice's room, just staring at her closet. Alice's closet was really small. If I were to stand in there, no one else would be able to get inside. I thought I was going crazy when I heard not one, not two, but a cacophony of whispers coming from behind that door. Whispers of different tones, some old and some young, women, men, fucking animals. So many different vocal tones were just whispering away. That moment was when I realized that, yeah, there was something wrong. There is something here that cannot be explained away with science. I stood there, right outside, and I was fucking terrified. Eventually, the whispers started to speak in unison. They started to say my name.
John. 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 John.
My hands trembled as I reached towards the door handle, and I opened it. Silence. Pure silence, and the closet was empty. Well, it was filled with Alice's clothes, but sitting there, on the floor, was that damn doll. I was irrational, maybe hysterical, so I grabbed the doll and threw it right into the trash bin outside. I covered it in more trash. Hell, I just started throwing things away just to bury it. When I finished the deed, Alice and Rose returned home with the food. I was so relieved to see them. When we got back into the house, the space felt so much lighter. After dinner, Alice ran into her room to play. I told Rose what had happened, and she grabbed my hand. She was so thankful. "Mommy, do we have any more blankets?" Alice shouted from her room. We were confused. Rose responded, "Maybe? Why?" "Dolly brought some more of her friends, and they want to stay in my room," she laughed. I dashed into her room, and sure enough, in her hands was Dolly. Dolly seems to have a lot of friends," I said nervously. She giggled. "Dolly has tons and tons of friends. Her best friend wants to make sure she has all the friends in the world." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Her best friend. He makes sure that we all love Dolly with all of our hearts. If not, something bad will happen." She turned her head to me slowly. "Do you love Dolly?" Of course I do, silly girl," I said. My voice was shaking. Weeks had gone by, and things just got worse. I even called a priest, but they didn't want to even step foot into our home. Some help. Alice seemed to be absolutely fine. She didn't notice anything wrong. But us, Rose and I, we started to hear them, see them, feel them. Dolly's friends. One night, we both woke up looking at each other. It was absolutely freezing that night. We couldn't move an inch, but we were able to look at each other. There was something rustling underneath our blanket between us, and it was breathing heavily. It sounded wet and garbled as it breathed in and out. It started to creep its way towards our faces, and we saw a disfigured gray face of a child. It looked at Rose and then at me. It emerged from the blanket and it began to climb onto our headboard. A long, dried umbilical cord slithered past our faces. All we could do was just stare at each other. I tried to look over at it from the corner of my eye, and my heart, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Hanging from the ceiling were dozens and dozens of disfigured children. All of them peered down onto us with dark eyeless sockets. Another figure was moving underneath our blanket between us. It felt cold as its body brushed against me and its head peeked out of the blanket. Dolly. We closed our eyes. We shut them tight with all of our strength as we were surrounded by whispers. John, Rose, John, Rose, Rose, John, Rose, John, Rose. They whispered to us all night until we heard Alice ask,
"Do you love Dolly?"
So we lay there in silence, nodding our heads yes in agreement. We feel like we are running out of options. I've tried burning the thing, throwing it out of a moving car, breaking it, cutting it, fucking burying it. But, it always comes back. And every fucking time she comes back, she brings more and more friends.